Subarnalata by Ashapurna Debi, or Devi. I'm not sure on the pronunciation. I have seen it spelled D-E-B-I and D-E-V-I, and these are probably transliterations of her name as it's spoken in Bengali. One would be more accurate than the other. I'm not sure which is correct, and it's also possible that both are, depending on the context. Subarnalata is the name of the main character in this novel. It is the second of a trilogy, and you can read them independently, which is what I'm actually doing. Subarnalata is married off, and she is in an unhappy marriage, primarily because her mother-in-law is a bitch. Okay, so a lot of people have been in marriages where they don't get along with their in-laws, but for the most part, in Western culture, modern Western culture, we don't have to live with them. When Subarnalata went off and got married, she had to move into her husband's family's house. This scene that takes place towards the middle of the novel. Subarna is Subarnalata. Subala is one of her closest friends, and Pulashwari is Subala's mother-in-law. And here Subarnalata is seeing the difference between the way her mother-in-law treats her and the way Subala's mother-in-law treats her. Very interesting contrast, but it lays out clearly the trap that a lot of women were in those days in India, in that they're totally at the whim of their in-laws. Subala was lucky in her mother-in-law. Subarnalata was not. Pulashwari had moved from the veranda to the courtyard, together with all the paraphernalia for her needlework. When the sun began to set, she would rush to the roof to catch the last of the daylight. Her eyesight was not as strong as before. She could not stitch at night by lamplight. Subarna watched her with amazement and admiration in her eyes. She had not met Subala's mother-in-law before. She had no idea one's husband's mother could be so full of love and affection. Pulashwari appeared to treat Subala with more kindness than her own mother did. Not once had Subarna heard her raise her voice or question anything Subala had decided to do. She spent most of her time doing embroidery, helping Subala with household chores when she could. Very strong contrast between the two mothers-in-law. You can sense that without even knowing about the mother-in-law, just from the fact that she couldn't imagine a mother-in-law who treated her daughter-in-law with kindness and with love. Subarnalata was forced to live with her husband in the back room of the house, where it was dark and claustrophobic. She eventually got used to it, but she was never happy there. Eventually, when her husband had enough money, they had their own house. By then they had children, and almost as if to punish herself, she chose for herself the darkest and most claustrophobic room in the house to live in. The greatest desire of Subarnalata's life was to become a writer. And there was virtually almost no possibility of that happening for a woman in her position at the time the story takes place. But she wrote anyway, and she kept her papers together until she heard of a neighbor who opened a printing press for the purposes of advertising and maybe printing booklets or pamphlets for businesses, things of that nature. And this is, as she's older, towards the end of her life, this happens, and she decides that she's going to self-publish. So she put everything together and handed the material off to the publisher to be printed. And periodically she goes back to him and says, "Is it done yet?" "No, it'll be done soon, it'll be done soon." And eventually she gets boxes and boxes of books from the publisher delivered, and she's just amazed at the number of boxes the books she contracted for came to. And then she sat down and opened one and saw a book that was essentially gibberish. She had not known that the printer was illiterate. This is the last nail in the coffin, as we might say, for Subarnalata. She dies a broken-hearted and diminished woman because she had poured her soul into this novel, and then to have nothing left of it except for boxes of books that had no meaning whatsoever. To her, it seemed like those books represented her life, that her life without that had no meaning. Excellent book. Very hard to get. If you're going to try and get a copy of Subarnalata, you're going to have to see if your library maybe has good resources. Probably find it in a university library rather than in public library. The last I saw, Amazon had 2 copies, and they were going for something like $40 a piece, which is not really conducive for most people's budgets to buy a book of this nature. If you're interested in it, I just, every 5 or 6 months plug into Abe Books or something of that nature and plug in the title and see what you come up with. I will put in the ISBN number for you in the notes below so that you can look up the novel if you're interested in it. Don't ask me for mine. I'm keeping it. Sorry.